The Vorketh diplomat watched Sergeant Maya Okonkwo's face crumple as she read the casualty list, and he made a note in his cognition log. Humans leak fluid from their eyes when distressed. Confirmed weakness response. Species rated fragile. He had no idea what he was witnessing was not surrender. It was the prelude to a storm, one his entire civilization's military doctrine had no equation for, no historical precedent, no defense. 3 days later, that same diplomat would be the only survivor of his entire delegation, hiding inside a maintenance shaft, listening to something that should not exist scream his species' name through the bulkheads of a dying station, and wondering, in the cold mathematics of his dying mind, how 400 years of conquest had been undone by a woman with a fire axe and a broken heart. The Kethari Compact had arrived 18 months earlier, sliding into the solar system with the quiet confidence of a species that had never lost a war. They were tall, chitin-plated, violet-eyed things, beautiful in the way that glaciers are beautiful, vast, cold, and entirely unconcerned with what they crushed beneath them. In 4 centuries of expansion, they had absorbed 11 sentient species into the compact, and each conquest had followed the same elegant formula. Observe, categorize, exploit the weakness, annex. They did not cry. They did not grieve audibly. They processed loss through something they called the stillness, a meditative shutdown that lasted exactly as long as biology required and not 1 second more, a precise, sterile, almost beautiful efficiency. To them, humanity's tears were data, and the data said inferior. They weep at funerals, Ambassador Threlshaw had reported to the Compact's War Council, his mandibles clicking with something close to amusement, his violet eyes catching the cold light of the briefing chamber. They weep at weddings. They weep watching recorded fictions about creatures that do not exist. A species that cannot regulate its own emotional output cannot be trusted to regulate a battlefield. Conquest will be efficient, so when the Kethari fleet began its diplomatic resource correction, a polite term for annexing 3 orbital colonies and shooting down anyone who objected, they expected resistance. They did not expect resilience, and they certainly did not expect Forward Operating Station Ember, a half-forgotten mining platform on the edge of the Kuiper Belt, to become the place where their entire theory of human nature collapsed into ash. Maya Okonkwo had buried her brother on Ember 11 days before the Kethari boarding party cut through the outer airlock. Private Daniel Okonkwo had been 23. Just 2 months earlier, he had floated beside her in the observation dome during a quiet shift, pointing at the distant, frozen ring of debris that circled their station, laughing about how their mother used to say the stars were just God's way of leaving the porch light on. Maya had laughed too, that night, easily, brightly, the way siblings laugh when they still believe they have decades left to annoy each other. He had died not in combat, but doing something achingly human, running back into a depressurizing corridor to drag an unconscious engineer to safety, and losing the race against the vacuum by 4 seconds. Maya had held what was left of him while the emergency seals hissed shut around them, and she had cried. Loud, ugly, unrestrained sobs that echoed down the steel corridors and were recorded, unknowingly, by a Kethari reconnaissance drone that had slipped past Ember's outer sensors 3 days earlier. That recording had been shown to the entire invasion fleet as proof of concept. "This is your enemy," Threlshaw had told 200 assembled Kethari Marines, gesturing at the looping footage of a grief-shattered woman on her knees. "This is what awaits you. Soft things, loud things, things that announce their pain to the universe instead of containing it. We will take this station with minimal resistance." He was not wrong about the resistance being minimal. For the first 6 minutes, the boarding party breached through Cargo Bay 7 at 0347 station time, 11 armored Kethari troopers moving with the silent, segmented grace of their species, plasma rifles humming low, their boots clicking against the deck in perfect, unhurried unison. Station Ember's defense consisted of 19 miners, 4 engineers, and a 6-person security detail that had not slept properly in a week, running on stale coffee and the kind of fear that makes hands shake on triggers. It should have been a slaughter in the Kethari's favor. For a moment, it was. 2 miners went down in the first volley, their bodies thrown back against bulkheads slick with condensation and fear sweat. The station's lights flickered amber, the emergency klaxon beginning its mournful wail, smoke curling from a ruptured conduit and catching in throats already raw with panic. And Maya Okonkwo, who had been running maintenance diagnostics 3 decks up when the breach alarm tore through her headset, Heard her brother's name shouted over the comms by someone calling for a medic that didn't exist anymore. Something in her simply stopped being afraid. The Kethari would later struggle to describe, in their own dispassionate scientific terms, what happened next. Their cognition logs, recovered weeks later from the wreckage, used phrases like unanticipated neurochemical cascade and behavioral discontinuity exceeding predictive models by 400%. What they meant in language a human would understand was simpler. She broke, and what was underneath was not weakness. Maya did not grab a rifle. She grabbed a fire axe from the bulkhead bracket beside her, and she ran toward the gunfire, not away from it, screaming a sound that the station's audio logs would later transcribe simply as the lead Kethari trooper, a veteran of 40 compact campaigns named Vash Orun, turned his rifle toward the sound and hesitated for exactly 0.3 seconds, an eternity in close-quarters combat, because his targeting systems could not categorize what they were seeing. Human heart rate, 190 beats per minute. Cortisol and adrenaline readings spiking past every baseline in the Compact's extensive database on the species. Pupils blown wide. Pain receptors according to the drone's bioscan, firing and being ignored. The axe came down through his weapon arm before his hesitation ended. What followed across the next 11 minutes was not recorded in any training manual the Kethari possessed, because nothing like it had been documented in the 400 years since the Compact began its long, grinding expansion across the stars. Maya Okonkwo did not fight like a soldier. She fought like grief given mass and velocity. She took 2 plasma burns across her left shoulder and did not stop moving. She broke Vash Orun's mandible with the axe handle and did not register the trooper's return strike that cracked 2 of her ribs. When a second trooper grabbed her from behind, she drove her skull backward into his faceplate with enough force to shatter the polymer, and the sound she made was not a war cry. The Kethari translation matrices would later flag it as something closer to a sob, weaponized, given teeth. "She is crying," one trooper reported over comms, genuinely bewildered, in the seconds before Maya buried the axe in his chest plate. "She is crying, and she is winning." Other crew members, hearing the chaos, did not flee. This was the second thing the Kethari had catastrophically failed to predict, that human grief was contagious in ways their own stillness never could be. Engineer Sam Reyes, who had lost his daughter to a Kethari bombardment of Colony Mirasol 4 months prior, picked up a welding torch and walked into the firefight with tears streaming down a face locked into something between agony and absolute resolve. Security Chief Adaisi Bello, who had not cried once since her wife's funeral, and had begun to believe something in her had gone permanently numb, found that numbness cracking open like ice over a spring flood, and she emptied her sidearm with hands that shook from rage rather than fear. "They don't fight like they're trying to survive," Threll Show would later say, reviewing the footage with mandibles trembling, an expression his species reserved for genuine existential confusion. "They fight like they've already decided to die, and dying with the enemy is simply a bonus." By the time the boarding party's emergency recall signal blared, too late for 9 of the 11 troopers, Cargo Bay 7 looked less like a battlefield and more like the inside of a wound, and Maya Okonkwo stood in the center of it, axe hanging from a hand that no longer fully obeyed her, blood that was not entirely her own running down her face, weeping without a single sound, because by then there were no sounds left in her. Threll Show came aboard Ember personally 4 days later, under a flag of parley, because his superiors needed to understand what had gone wrong before the next wave of correction fleets arrived. He found Maya in the station's makeshift infirmary, ribs bound, shoulder regenerating under a cheap medkit patch, sitting beside the cryopod that held what remained of her brother, because Ember's small chapel had no other quiet place left standing. "I do not understand," Threll Show said, and to his credit the confusion in his translated voice was genuine, almost plaintive. "Our models indicated total psychological collapse. Subject demonstrated all markers of severe grief trauma. By every metric we possess, you should have been incapacitated." Maya looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, hollow, exhausted in a way that went past the body and into something deeper. But they were steady. "You watched us cry," she said quietly, "and you thought that was the whole story. You thought grief was the wound. It's not. Grief is just love that ran out of places to go." She gestured, slow and tired, at the cryopod beside her. "My brother had 4 seconds to save a stranger's life, and he spent every one of them. That's not weakness, Ambassador. That's the most powerful thing our species does. We feel everything, all the way down, no filters, no stillness. And then instead of shutting it off like you do, we let it become fuel. Fuel for violence, Threlshow said. Fuel for whatever the moment needs, Maya corrected. Sometimes that's violence. Sometimes it's a stranger giving you their last ration pack. Sometimes it's standing in a hallway full of armed soldiers when you have nothing left to lose because you already lost the thing that mattered most. Her voice cracked, just slightly, and she let it. She didn't hide it from him. That too was the point. You built an entire war doctrine on the idea that creatures who cry can't also be the ones who make you cry. You never once asked what happens when both things are true in the same heartbeat. Thralshow was silent for a long moment, the closest his species came to the stillness while still fully conscious, fully present. 9 of my soldiers, he finally said. Veterans, decorated, dead to a mining crew that had 4 hours of combat training between them. They weren't fighting a mining crew, Maya said. They were fighting everyone we've ever loved and lost. You just couldn't see the rest of us standing behind every swing of that axe. The Kethari Compact did not retreat from the system. Not immediately, not gracefully. Empires rarely do either. But the War Council's correction timeline, once measured in confident months, dissolved into years of cautious, costly stalemate, because the strategists could no longer build predictive models around an enemy whose breaking point apparently fed their strength instead of ending it. Threlshow's final report to the Compact, recovered later by human intelligence and translated with a kind of reverent disbelief, contained a single line that would eventually be carved, half as joke and half as monument, into the new memorial wall built on Station Ember. Recommend reclassification of species threat designation. Their tears are not surrender. Their tears are the warning shot before the storm arrives. Do not mistake the rain for weakness. Wait, and you will see what the rain becomes. Maya Okonkwo did not become a legend in the way songs are written, with triumphant choruses and clean victories. She became something quieter and more enduring, the woman who taught a generation of recruits that you did not have to choose between feeling and fighting, between grief and strength, between the tears that fell at her brother's funeral and the fury that broke an alien soldier's arm 4 seconds later. Both were her. Both, she would say, are all of us. On the anniversary of the breach, every year after, the surviving crew of Ember gathered in the rebuilt cargo bay, scarred steel deliberately left unpolished, a reminder rather than a wound to hide. And they did not give speeches about courage or duty. They simply stood together, and when the grief came, as it always did, they let it come. No stillness, no suppression, no shame, because they had learned in the worst 11 minutes of their lives the secret the Kethari never understood until it was carved into their own history. Humanity does not survive despite its tears. It survives, and rages, and ultimately endures, because of them.